The man known to history as Mao Zedong, or Chairman Mao, was born on the 26th of December 1893 in the village of Shaoshan in the province of Hunan in southern China. His father was Mao Yichang, who had been raised in a family of poverty-stricken peasants. However, after serving in the Xiang army for a few years in his youth, Yichang had returned to his native region and begun working as a farmer. He soon acquired enough money to become a lender in the district, and this, combined with his agricultural work, allowed him to become one of the more prosperous farmers in the Shaoshan area, eventually coming into possession of about 20 acres of land. Mao's mother was Wen Qimei, a devout Buddhist who had a troubled upbringing. Her father was a poor shoemaker who drank heavily, and her mother had been his concubine. Mao's childhood was less than ideal. His father was a strict disciplinarian whose method of parenting primarily involved beating Mao and his 3 siblings if they did not do as they were told. Their mother tried to temper his outbursts, but with little effect. Young Mao developed an interest in his mother's Buddhism when he was younger, though he soon became disenchanted with religion, and when he was just 8 years old, he was sent to the local primary school in Shaoshan. Just as the 20th century was dawning, his education there was a mixture of traditional Chinese learning centered on Confucianism combined with the centuries-old values of the Far East, along with a sprinkling of influences from the encroaching Western world which could not be avoided in China by the 1900s. Additionally, the young Mao developed an interest early on in history and politics. When he was 13 years old, his father arranged for him to be married to Liu Yixiu, the 17-year-old daughter of another prosperous local farmer. But Mao demonstrated his rebellious streak at a young age and refused to honor the arranged marriage, causing something of a controversy in the Shaoshan area. And as a result of this disagreement, the teenage Mao temporarily left his father's farm, although he returned before very long. Mao was growing up at a time when China was experiencing momentous change. Like Korea and Japan to the east, China had first come into contact with European traders and religious missionaries in the 16th and early 17th centuries. And like them, the Chinese had quickly become wary of the newcomers and had restricted their contacts with them to 1 or 2 ports in the southeast of the country, where a tiny amount of trade was conducted. It continued like this for nearly 2 centuries, with China remaining largely closed to a world which was modernizing without it. It remained highly conservative in its religious, social and political values, changing little and continuing to be ruled by an emperor and a closed government of imperial rituals and administrators as it had been for centuries. But by the mid-19th century, China again, like Japan and Korea, could no longer prevent the Europeans, with their modern warships, guns and industrial power, from interfering in their countries. With the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, Britain forced China to end its self-imposed isolation, following which China experienced a flood of European contact, and with it came not just British opium, but ideas about different types of government, new economic developments, and all manner of technological innovation. Perhaps the most striking and revolutionary of these new ideas, which arrived into China from the mid-19th century onwards, was the knowledge that the Europeans and the Americans were not ruled by powerful monarchs and emperors anymore. Many lived under republics governed by the people, and even where some of these countries still had emperors or empresses such as Queen Victoria in Britain, she was essentially a figurehead, and it was Parliament that actually ruled the British Empire. Moreover, these democracies were not all alike. Some were very conservative, some were more liberal, and some had different degrees of economic development. And there were also competing ideas about how they should be reformed and developed, with some wanting the wealthy to hold a great amount of power, and others who believed that power and wealth should be distributed equally throughout society. And there were more extreme ideas again. One of these, developed in particular by the German political scientist Karl Marx in the mid-19th century, argued that all wealth and goods should be held in communal ownership. He called this communism. In early 20th century China, these ideas would soon lead to great change, as many began questioning why they were still ruled by the emperor of the nearly 300-year-old Qing dynasty. As Mao entered his teenage years, he was already reading about these political ideas. He was particularly interested in calls for a democracy to be established in China to replace the imperial government, and also the republican writings of Sun Yat-sen, who had become a figurehead for the republican movement within China. He would soon see these desires confirmed. Just as Mao was starting at a new school in Changsha, the country was entering into a period of rapid change. Regional famines had struck parts of China in the late 1900s and early 1910s, and this, combined with numerous regional uprisings throughout the country and growing calls for a more representative government, led to an army revolt in October 1911. At first, the imperial government of Emperor Puyi, who was just a 6-year-old child, tried to address the grievances of the dissenters, but it soon became apparent that a more drastic shift would be necessary. After weeks of negotiations, it was determined in February 1912 that the emperor would abdicate and a new Republic of China would be established, with the imperial officer Yuan Shikai serving as its first president of a national government. Thus, an empire which had been in existence for centuries had ended. It was, however, very unclear in the mid-1910s exactly in what direction China's politics would now head. These were striking developments, and ones which Mao had not been entirely removed from. When the conflict erupted late in 1911, he had enlisted in the rebel army as an 18-year-old recruit. Now, in the spring of 1912, he simply returned to school, and it was around this time that he first started reading about the idea of socialism and communism as more radical forms of government. Yet he remained unconvinced that this was the best approach for China at that time. Meanwhile, his education continued. He determined at some point around 1913 that he would become a teacher, and so he enrolled in the first normal school of Hunan, widely regarded at the time as the best in the province. Here he became a popular and accomplished student, reading widely, being elected secretary of the student society, and eventually finishing as one of the highest-ranked students in the school. More pivotally, in terms of his later activities, Mao was increasingly exposed to the socialist ideas he had first encountered a few years earlier, and over time he began to find that he agreed more with what he read, particularly so as the environment of the first normal school was one of radical political thought, especially during China's first forays into representative government. In 1917, Mao moved to Peking, now Beijing, where one of his main influences at this time, Yang Changji, had taken a job at the Peking University. Here, Mao also took a job as a library assistant, but he was increasingly moving in circles of individuals who favored socialism and communism or Marxism as a solution to China's political woes. Even with the establishment of the Republic in 1912, the country had continued to experience turbulence as conservative and liberal forces fought amongst each other, and regional warlords and power groups exercised quasi-regional independence throughout the country. Marxism appealed to many at this time because the Bolsheviks, a branch of Russian communism, had secured control of the Russian government in the autumn of 1917, just months after the fall of the autocratic Tsarist government there. Perhaps, many thought, communism was also suitable for China, which had just done away with its own fossilized autocratic imperial government. Mao was increasingly leaning towards that viewpoint himself in 1918 and 1919, an outlook which was compounded when he experienced the bourgeois hostility of the Beijing upper and middle class towards a country boy like himself. It was in Beijing that Mao's awakening as a political radical fully occurred. China was drifting ever further into political anarchy in the late 1910s as a buoyant nationalist movement led by Sun Yat-sen sought to rejuvenate the republic in its infancy, which the nationalists perceived as being governed by a weak, conservative regime with too many links to the old imperial past. In parts of the country, the government could exercise its authority, but in others it was little more than a government in name only. This instability was augmented when the Chinese government failed to secure the former German concession of Shandong at the Versailles peace negotiations in Paris, Following the end of the First World War, the nationalists considered it an affront to national pride when this piece of mainland China was instead granted to Japan, a nation which had been exercising its strength across East Asia since the late 19th century, when it had modernized in a far more successful manner than China. And the Shandong controversy was a direct cause of a major student protest which occurred in Beijing on the 4th of May 1919. This was driven by a younger generation of political activists like Mao, who were tired of China's seeming impotence on the world stage and disordered internal politics. The movement would continue afterwards and lead indirectly to the Chinese Civil War many years later. The May 4th movement, the awakening of China's younger generations to radical politics, is generally seen as the origins of the Communist Party of China. The events of 1919 led many young Chinese people who were interested in politics to increasingly turn their backs on the Western liberals of Britain, France, and America who had betrayed them on Shandong, and increasingly to turn towards the Marxism and Leninism that was gradually winning the Russian Civil War and cementing its control over Russia. As we have seen, Mao was already interested in communism by 1919, but it was only in the months following the May 4th protests that he began to fully commit himself to it. And that summer, he organized several student organizations into an umbrella body to protest against the Japanese presence in Shandong. This is the first clear sign of his abilities as an organizer, and his writings around this time and into 1920 began to speak of the Army of the Red Flag and to the victories won by the communists in Russia. By the time that the Communist Party of China was formally established in the summer of 1921, Mao had proclaimed himself to be a communist, believing that the ideology would be the basis for the coming revolution in China. It would be a slow ascent towards that revolution, however. In the meantime, Mao married again in 1920 to Yang Kai-hui, the daughter of one of his former teachers. Then, in July 1921, he attended the first Congress of the Communist Party of China. A decision was taken early on by the new party to accept aid from Russia, but also to establish an alliance with Sun Yat-sen's Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, which would soon be led by a younger nationalist by the name of Chiang Kai-shek. Mao was one of the first of the Chinese communists to also join the Nationalist Party, in the belief that the conservative Chinese political establishment would only be overthrown if the nationalists and the communists worked in league with each other. As such, he spent much of the 1920s living in the nationalist stronghold of Guangzhou province and working as an organizer and propagandist for both the communists and the nationalists simultaneously. And throughout this period, Mao was gaining a greater appreciation of the struggles of the Chinese peasantry throughout the country and the strength in sheer numbers which they had, if they were won over to the communist cause. As such, the early and mid-1920s were formative, if somewhat unremarkable years in Mao's career. This all began to change in 1926. With the death of Sun Yat-sen in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek had taken over the leadership of the nationalists. By this time, his party, the Kuomintang, had control over large parts of southern China, but the country was still highly fragmented, with the conservative government of the Republic holding Beijing and much of the north, and quasi-independent Chinese warlords who were vestiges of the imperial past holding other parts of the country. In 1926, Chiang determined to force the issue and launched a nationalist military campaign to seize Beijing. The Northern Expedition, as it has become known, was a major success, and during the course of 1926 and 1927, the nationalists seized power in many of the major cities. But the very success of the Northern Expedition also led to civil war. Now, the loose alliance, which the Chinese communists and the nationalists had been in since 1921, was effectively ended by Chiang Kai-shek, who had grown wary of the expanding power of the communists and the role Russia wished to play in China. Once the conservative regime in Beijing was done away with, the result was a split itself within the Nationalist Party in 1927, between Chiang's right-leaning nationalists and a left-leaning faction which wished to accommodate the communists. These events are typically seen as the beginning of the Chinese Civil War, which would last for over 20 years. In the summer of 1927, Chiang Kai-shek's newly ascendant Kuomintang began a crackdown on communists throughout China. Thousands were killed, and the party was suppressed in many places. Mao's reaction to this major setback and the inception of civil war between the nationalists and the communists was to retreat with several hundred followers into the wilderness around the Jinggang Mountains on the border of Hunan province. It was the beginning of a long period of guerrilla warfare during which the Communist Party, with tacit aid from Russia, sought to disrupt the rule of the nationalists in anticipation of mass urban revolts by workers throughout the country against the new government. These were often tough years for Mao. His wife and sister were beheaded by the nationalists in 1930, though in his new life as a guerrilla fighter in rural China, he had formed a relationship with He Zizhen, whom he married soon after Yang Kai-hui was killed. It was also around this time that he determined on a new course. Instead of waiting for a revolt of the Chinese urban proletariat, he would attempt the same strategy as had brought the Chinese nationalists to power, building up a territory which he would control and expand outwards. In February 1930, Mao, who by now was one of the senior commanders of the Chinese Communist movement, established the Southwest Jiangxi Provincial Soviet government in Jiangxi province. Although the nationalists controlled most of the country, for a few years here in the early 1930s, Mao established a Chinese Soviet state in Jiangxi, with him serving as the chairman. The Red Army had also expanded and was now under the overall control of Zhou Enlai, with the wider Chinese Communist Party focusing attentions on Jiangxi as a safe base for them in the early 1930s. Indeed, Mao, Enlai, and the Red Army saw off several efforts by Chiang Kai-shek to wrest control of the province back from them in the early 1930s by encircling Jiangxi. However, this military response was limited by the nationalists, in part because it had found itself embroiled in a conflict on the other side of China in the early 1930s, as the Empire of Japan invaded the northeastern Chinese provinces of Manchuria and established a puppet state called Manchukuo there. It was just the beginning of heightened Japanese involvement in China in the 1930s, but once the initial furore concerning Manchuria died down, Chiang set his sights on finally reclaiming Jiangxi province from Mao and the communists in the mid-1930s. In September 1933, the Chinese nationalists began the fifth encirclement of Mao and the communists in Jiangxi province. This effectively involved an enormous siege by the nationalists, and one which would prove too large for the Red Army to repulse. By the summer of 1934, it was clear that Mao and his followers would either have to surrender or break out of the besieged area. They chose the latter, and the resulting events have become part of Communist Party law. In October 1934, Communist forces consisting of 86,000 troops, 15,000 personnel, and 35 women broke through nationalist enemy lines and began an epic retreat from their encircled headquarters in southwest China. The Long March, as it became known, lasted 368 days and covered 6,000 miles. They crossed 24 rivers and 18 mountain ranges. Weapons and supplies were borne on the backs of fighters or in horse-drawn carts, and at times the line of marchers stretched for 50 miles. Only 4,000 troops completed the journey. Enduring starvation, aerial bombardment, and almost daily skirmishes with nationalist forces, Mao eventually halted his columns at the foot of the Great Wall of China. The Long March is regarded as the longest continuous march in the history of warfare and marked the emergence of Mao Zedong as the undisputed leader of the Chinese Communists. The months after the Long March saw a curious drift in Chinese politics towards a rapprochement between the Communists and the Nationalists. For years, the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek had been dealing with problems on multiple fronts. As well as the Communists, there was the perhaps greater problem posed by the Empire of Japan and its ambitions to dominate the Far East politically and militarily. This had already resulted in the invasion of Manchuria and the establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo in the early 1930s, But as the years went by, it was clear that the emperor's government in Tokyo had ambitions for an even greater land grab in China. Accordingly, many within the nationalist movement believed it would be best to put aside their differences with the communists for the foreseeable future and form a coherent opposition to the impending Japanese attack. And for their part, Mao and his followers were encouraged to do the same by Moscow. Thus, during the course of 1935 and 1936, Mao's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists were once again drifting towards an alliance of convenience. The drive towards doing so was accelerated in July 1937 when the Japanese again invaded China and proceeded to militarily occupy many of the major cities along its eastern coast, massacring tens of thousands of Chinese civilians in cities such as Nanjing in the process. The Chinese Civil War now morphed into the Second Sino-Japanese War, and in turn, that would become a constituent part of the Second World War in later years. By the end of 1937, the communists and the nationalists were formally allied with each other again after Chiang Kai-shek caved in to pressure to do so from within his own ranks. And Mao also married again around this time to Jiang Qing, an actress who would become his fourth and final wife. As an example of his growing ruthlessness, his former wife He Zejun was packed off to the Soviet Union, where she was placed in a mental asylum. Meanwhile, the nature of the struggle against Japan, which would play out for the next several years, was beginning to become clear. The nationalists moved inland towards central China as the Japanese occupied the rich cities and farmland of the coastal regions of eastern China. Here, in the inland provinces, the nationalists and the communists would wage a war of attrition with the Japanese to the east for the next few years. And these were significant years in terms of the support Mao and the communists enjoyed. In the course of the late 1930s and early 1940s, Mao's Red Army ballooned in size from approximately 50,000 to nearly 500,000 fighters. Thus, the war with Japan was finally creating the kind of countrywide support for the Communist Party which Mao and the other leaders had failed to acquire in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Already by 1940, there were signs of Mao's communists being able to win considerable victories against the Japanese occupation forces. During a campaign which became known as the 100 Regiments Campaign in August 1940, the 400,000-strong Red Army moved against the Japanese in simultaneous attacks against 5 of the coastal provinces, attacks which resulted in the deaths of upwards of 20,000 Japanese troops, as well as a severe disruption to Japanese supply routes. Late 1941 and early 1942 brought setbacks, although the Japanese made a series of sweeping conquests across the Western Pacific, notably seizing Singapore and Burma from the British and the Philippines from the United States, following the declaration of war on the US in December, with the surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. While these conquests initially put the Japanese in the ascendancy in Eastern Asia, the entry of Japan into the wider Second World War also ensured that the nationalists and the communists now had allies in the shape of the British and Americans. With increased military, financial and logistical support being received, they were able to ensure that the Japanese occupation of eastern China was never comfortable during the Second World War. As the war was grinding onwards throughout the first half of the 1940s, the Chinese Communist Party continued to grow in power, and so did Mao as its leader. The nature of the war of resistance against the Japanese favored the communists over the nationalists. For starters, the communists were more attuned to how to wage guerrilla war, having done so for many years against the nationalist government in the late 1920s and early 1930s. As a consequence, they were better prepared for doing so against the Japanese, and as they won a series of victories against the Japanese, the Red Army became the more attractive option for Chinese people seeking to oppose the foreign occupation. Moreover, Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang seemed to many to simply be the Chinese manifestation of the right-wing movements which had brought Japan into China to begin with. And as the Chinese Communist Party, or CPC, expanded in size, Mao also consolidated his control. In 1943, he acquired the chairmanship of both the party secretariat and the Politburo of the party for the first time. It was also during these war years that he began affirming that Chinese communism would have a distinctly different shape than that which had developed in Russia. Beijing would be no puppet of Moscow in future years. The nature of the war against the Japanese changed from 1943 onwards, as Japan suffered a series of severe setbacks in its struggle against the United States, while its European allies, Germany and Italy, were also fighting an increasingly doomed war against Russia, Britain and the US. Once the Allies were victorious there, all their resources would be employed against the Empire of Japan. Consequently, in the final years of the war, thoughts once again turned to China's politics and who would hold power once the country had been freed from the Japanese. As early as 1940, there were serious cracks in the alliance between Mao's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, and by 1942, open fighting between the two had broken out yet again as the Chinese Civil War resumed. It would fully erupt again following the end of the Pacific War. On the 6th and 9th of August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, which Japan had occupied all the way back in 1931. As a result, within weeks, the Empire of Japan had formally surrendered to the Allies. The Second World War was over, and the Chinese Civil War once more commenced between the nationalists and Mao's communists. Mao was in a far more advantageous position in 1945 than he had been 10 years earlier after the Long March. If the Long March had kept the Chinese Communist movement alive, then the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 and the 8 years of war with Japan allowed the Communists to strengthen their position immensely. In a curious twist of history, the Japanese invasion of China indirectly led to the Communists seizing power in the country. Early in 1946, Mao was handed an extra advantage when Stalin handed over Manchuria to the Chinese Communist Party. Yet it would take 3 years of further intense fighting between the Communists and the Nationalists before a breakthrough was made. In September 1948, the Communists secured full control of east-central China in the region south of Beijing with the capture of Shandong province in the Huaihai campaign. Then, in the winter of 1948, Mao launched the Pingjin campaign against Chiang Kai-shek's forces in northern China. Over a 2-month campaign, over 500,000 nationalist troops were killed, captured or wounded, and the north of the country was left in communist hands. With northern China largely secured by early 1949, Mao and the Red Army commanders took the decision that spring to drive south of the Yangtze River into the heartland of nationalist-held territory. This was done despite the efforts of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to encourage Mao to form a coalition government with the nationalists. Stalin did not want a rival for power amongst the communist leaders, but he would soon have one. On the 23rd of April 1949, the Red Army seized the nationalist capital of Nanjing. A series of further striking gains saw Chiang Kai-shek retreat south with his remaining supporters to Guangzhou by the autumn of 1949. Just weeks later, he and the remaining nationalists decided to make a strategic retreat from the Chinese mainland to the island of Formosa, more commonly known today as Taiwan. Here, the nationalists formed a government which they proclaimed as the continuation of the Republic of China, which had been established back in 1911. Meanwhile, back on the mainland, Mao had proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China on the 1st of October 1949. The Chinese Civil War between the Communists and the Nationalists was at an end, after more than 20 years of conflict. Mao now entered office as the first chairman of the Central People's Government. The first measure to be taken was to tidy up the loose ends of the war. In the spring of 1950, the Red Army launched a campaign against the island of Hunan off the southeast coast of China. Within weeks, the 100,000-strong nationalist forces there were forced to surrender. The international community now expected that Mao would proceed with an invasion of Taiwan, and indeed, even the American government, a longtime supporter of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, had decided not to recognize his new regime in Taiwan in the belief that it would soon be defeated by Mao and the communists. But no invasion came, and despite numerous crises between the two sides, Taiwan remains self-governing to this day. And this period immediately after the conclusion of the Civil War also saw Mao head to Moscow in the winter of 1949 to 1950. Here he secured large injections of Russian financial support for China, as well as technological advisors, although the agreement came with a tacit admission by Mao of Stalin's primacy within the communist world. Mao would have to wait several years before he could attempt to go his own way. The post-war years in China saw the initiation of wide-ranging political, social and economic reforms. Firstly, a massive land reform campaign was initiated to transfer agricultural land out of the hands of large-scale farmers and landlords and into the hands of poorer peasants. While this reduced economic inequality, it was not without violence, and there were many instances of the former landlords being attacked or even murdered across China in the early 1950s. In tandem, a huge drive was initiated to crack down on opium production and consumption across the country, a habit which was partly a legacy of British meddling into the Chinese economy in the 19th century. In the 1950s, millions of opium addicts and habitual users were press-ganged into labor reform camps. They were joined in these by the hundreds of thousands of individuals who Mao's regime branded as counter-revolutionaries, many of them being former members of the Kuomintang. And Mao also launched the new People's Republic onto the world stage by entering into the Korean War, which broke out in the summer of 1950 between a communist North and an American-backed South. Massive Chinese aid ensured that the conflict ended in a stalemate 3 years later. It also led to a split of relations between Mao's new regime and the United States, one which involved a trade embargo which lasted for over 20 years. In the 1950s, Mao had formed a clear idea of how he believed communism should develop in China. It would be incorrect to assume that Mao Zedong was simply a powermonger who used communist ideology to secure authority in China. Certainly, he was a brutal autocrat, a fact which would become strikingly clear as his long chairmanship continued on into the 1960s and 1970s. But he had also read widely on Marxist-Leninist thought and had a vision for how communism would develop in China. In the early 1950s, that vision involved the industrial capacity of China's burgeoning cities of the East Coast and its great rivers, leading the country away from its reliance on agriculture. As Mao described it, the communists had come to power by the Red Army encircling the cities occupied by the nationalists and the Japanese, and then absorbing the cities when they were strong enough. Now, the direct opposite was needed. China's cities would need to expand outward and bring the country closer to achieving communism as Marx had intended it. To that end, in 1953, the first 5-year plan was initiated in China in imitation of the 5-year plans which the Soviet Union had begun employing in Russia in the 1920s. The first 5-year plan of 1953 to 1957 was geared primarily towards reducing the reliance of the Chinese economy on agricultural output and moving towards becoming a global power through the creation of an industrial economy. With Soviet financial support and expertise provided through Russian advisors, new factories were built across the country during the plan. Farms were collectivized across China and placed under state management, and billions of yuan were spent in total on completing 595 large and medium-sized infrastructural and economic projects, including railways, major roads, and new dams, often linking parts of China with each other in ways which had never been possible before. As a result, Chinese industrial productivity increased by 128%, and steel production alone jumped from 1.35 million tons in 1953 to over 5 million in 1957. Coal extraction doubled during the 5 years, while in agriculture, yields of grain and cotton rose by over 30% during the same time period. Overall, the first 5-year plan under Mao was a tremendous success in pure economic terms, but in its success were sown the seeds of destruction, for a hubris now entered into Mao and his colleagues' thinking, a hubris which would be injected with catastrophic consequences into the second 5-year plan, or as it is more commonly known, the Great Leap Forward. On the 22nd of May 1957, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, who had succeeded Stalin on his death in 1953, delivered a speech at a regional meeting of Soviet representatives, in the course of which he proclaimed that it was his goal that the Soviet Union should catch up and overtake America in economic output by 1980. A few months later, in November 1957, at a gathering in Moscow of international communist leaders to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, which had brought the Soviets to power in 1917, he repeated his claim. Only now he was even more ambitious. The Soviets would now eclipse the Americans within 15 years. Mao, who wished for China to rival the Soviet Union, and whose relationship with Khrushchev was more antagonistic than it had been with Stalin, began pondering this goal in the aftermath of the Soviet leader's speech. Not to be outdone, he quickly determined to make similar claims, and made it known that it was China's goal to catch up with Britain's economy within 15 years and exceed their production of steel and other core industrial outputs. With this goal in mind, in 1958, the Chinese Communist Party initiated the second 5-year plan, or what was soon referred to as the Great Leap Forward, for the country's economy. It would result in the most catastrophic famine the world has ever seen. Mao believed that the key indicators of how China's economy was progressing would be seen in grain and steel production. If these could be increased rapidly, it would show the Soviets in Moscow and the world in general that China was asserting itself on the world stage. Accordingly, all of the instruments of the state were deployed in 1958 to begin increasing the rate of grain and steel production by establishing new smelting factories and turning ever greater amounts of agricultural land over to grain production. Massive amounts of farmland were collectivized into giant state farms towards this end, and millions of workers were redeployed to different parts of the economy than they were trained for. Huge amounts of state funding were also given out to aid in the effort, and party officials were sent out into the countryside and the towns, charged with maximizing production. However, many of these initiatives were potentially hazardous to begin with, as the state was employing experimental farming methods in some instances, and in others was turning over land to grain production which was more suited to other crops. In other instances, workers were being sent into steel factories with little or no training in what they were doing. It was an inauspicious beginning in 1958, but one which would get much worse over time. Despite these structural issues, there were some initial signs of progress. Steel and iron production did increase in the initial stages of the Great Leap Forward, perhaps by as much as 30 to 40% in 1958, but the mechanism whereby it was being increased would prove catastrophic in some instances. In their eagerness to show good results, local party cadres throughout the country were often resorting to unimaginably short-sighted and brutal tactics. The more cruel methods involved overworking their laborers in the factories to try to have larger amounts of steel produced. But within a few months, party officials throughout the country were also setting up what became known as backyard furnaces, the use of which Mao had actually encouraged. These were essentially makeshift steel furnaces which were often set up in the yards of people's homes. Scrap metal was used to produce pig iron, which was almost totally useless. But the worst thing was that farming tools and other instruments which were needed for producing food throughout the country were often being thrown into these backyard furnaces and melted down so that local party officials could record higher outputs of alleged steel production in their areas. The result was a lack of basic tools for farming as the months went by. The effect of all this between 1958 and 1961 was catastrophic, with millions of farmers being press-ganged into working in factories in the cities and towns. There was not enough people available to produce food throughout China in a country which was often on a subsistence food level anyway. Added to this was the practice of party officials destroying basic farming equipment to inflate the amount of steel they were producing in their areas. Furthermore, the party had begun trying to use experimental irrigation methods, which had rendered large amounts of farmland temporarily unusable in some areas. Given all this, it is unsurprising that even by the autumn of 1958, just months after the Great Leap Forward had started, there were major food shortages in some parts of the country, and this was further compounded by the fact that the government continued to export grain and other agricultural products in order to increase its revenue and also keep up the appearance that productivity was increasing. By late 1958, people in certain parts of the country were beginning to start foraging for wild foods in the countryside, and others were starving to death. This was just the beginning though, and by 1959, grain production had fallen by roughly 15 to 20% in total across the country. There is considerable debate as to how much Mao knew about what was unfolding across China as a result of the Great Leap Forward. It is quite possible that in late 1958 and early 1959, he was unaware of the famine conditions, but evidence has been uncovered which suggests he knew by at least the late spring of 1959 and yet did not do enough to change course. By 1960, when he delegated control of certain parts of the Great Leap Forward program to others, the Central Party members were actively trying to prevent the worst, but by then it was too late. The forces which were unleashed in 1958 and 1959 reverberated into 1960 and 1961, and famine struck China over each of these years with varying degrees of severity. There have been many different estimates of the number of people who died in recent years, as the opening of certain archives in China has allowed for more accurate assessments, but scholars are generally agreed that at least 25 million people died in a country, the population of which was approximately 660 million in 1958. Frank Dictator, who studied the period in detail and who saw the Great Leap Forward as Mao's Great Famine, in the title of his study of these events, suggested the death toll was as many as 55 million people. Others would suggest somewhere between 30 and 45 million, making this the most catastrophic famine in human history in terms of sheer numbers of deaths. The second five-year plan, advertised as the Great Leap Forward, came to an end in 1962. Curiously, it was relatively underreported internationally, as much of the information concerning it was transmitted through the Republic of China's government in Taiwan or the British enclave of Hong Kong, and many foreign services believed they were exaggerating the extent of the suffering caused for political purposes. Internally, however, it had badly compromised Mao's leadership. On the 27th of April 1959, Mao's term as chairman of the People's Republic of China came to an end. Although he retained his position as chairman of the Communist Party and of military affairs, he was succeeded by Liu Shaoqi, and by January 1962, the Great Leap Forward was being wound down. At this time, Liu made a speech at what was to become known as the 7,000 Cadres Conference, in which he denounced the Great Leap Forward. It was a very thinly veiled public rebuke of Mao, the likes of which would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. Nevertheless, while Mao had lost some of his authority for now, he was still very much in charge. He would, however, have to govern in a more collective fashion, with figures such as Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, who had done much to recover the economic situation in the wake of the disastrous policies of the late 1950s. The 1960s also saw China increasingly isolated on the world stage. Tensions had been brewing between Mao and the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ever since the latter succeeded Stalin in the mid-1950s. Mao was particularly perturbed by Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin's brutal authoritarianism and more moderate stance towards the Western powers. He also found himself increasingly at loggerheads with Moscow about the two regimes' interpretation of orthodox Marxism. Relations were bad by the late 1950s, but they became particularly acute in the early 1960s, especially once the Cuban Missile Crisis inspired Khrushchev to begin working more closely with the US government of John F. Kennedy to defuse the Cold War in ways which Mao opposed. A sign of the split was seen in 1961, when Mao denounced the Soviet regime as revisionist traitors. For his part, Khrushchev was increasingly wary of Mao's attitude towards the possibility of a nuclear war with the West. Mao once worryingly suggested that if 300 million Chinese people died in a nuclear war, the other half would still be alive to secure victory. And so, the Russian leader must have been concerned in 1964 when the Chinese successfully tested their first nuclear bomb. But by then, the Sino-Soviet split was complete. While much is known about the political life of the man who oversaw this split with Russia and the catastrophes of the Great Leap Forward, the more private Mao remains something of an enigma. His fourth marriage, that to Jiang Qing in 1938, lasted for the remainder of his life, though Mao engaged in a string of extramarital affairs, including, most controversially, in his later life, with a private secretary, Zhang Yufeng, who was in her early 20s when she first entered Mao's employ. He had at least 10 children, several of whom had been born in the 1920s and with whom he had very little relationship, as he had had to leave them with others during the long Civil War years. He spent much of his private time writing and was a prolific composer of political writings and poems, while his reading habits tended to favor traditional Chinese literature. By temperament, he would become aggressive when challenged, but his demeanor was certainly not genuinely unhinged like Stalin had been in Russia during the 1930s and 1940s. For Mao, state violence was engaged in for political rather than personal purposes, but a great deal about his other personal motivations and inclinations are shrouded behind a public image which was closely managed during his lifetime. The Sino-Soviet split and the catastrophic consequences of the Great Leap Forward were the background against which Mao initiated what has today become known as simply the Cultural Revolution, but the full name of which was the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Launched in 1966, the Cultural Revolution was designed to be a political and social movement which aimed to purify Chinese society and Chinese communism by removing any of the vestiges of Chinese traditionalism which remained and the capitalist and bourgeois elements within it. Mao claimed that a bourgeois bureaucracy had developed within the Chinese Communist Party that was leading China in the wrong direction, and this, along with communist revisionists such as those who were now in power in Russia, needed to be stopped, and a renewed dedication to the communist cause developed. In particular, Mao called on the younger generations of China, those which had been born after the Second World War and who had never known life in China before communist rule, to bombard the headquarters to purify Chinese society of these bourgeois capitalist elements and to reinvigorate the communist movement. There has been a widespread debate as to what Mao's motivations for launching the Cultural Revolution were. Some historians have argued that he genuinely believed that the Chinese Communist Party and the huge administration which operated under it throughout China had been compromised by nearly 20 years in power, and that a cultural reawakening was necessary to stop the bureaucratic degeneration of the country. However, while this might have been a motivating factor for Mao, there is no doubt that the Cultural Revolution was primarily conceived as a way for the chairman to resuscitate his control over the Communist Party and the country as a whole. By its very nature, the movement allowed Mao to use the party's apparatus and wider organs of the state to purge the government of his opponents and competing factions. These had multiplied in number in the early 1960s as the catastrophic impact of the Great Leap Forward was felt across the country. Now, Mao would eliminate those who had dared to cross him in the most brutal purges seen within the Chinese Communist Party. The result would be years of unrest, which turned ordinary Chinese people against each other and created an environment of fear and suspicion. The Cultural Revolution was initiated in May 1966, with Mao urging the people and students in particular to act to purify the party ranks. Within weeks, gangs of students were attacking their teachers, intellectuals, government officials, and even people who were deemed to be wearing bourgeois clothing. These attacks could range from being mild to moderately violent, such as when teachers were attacked by gangs of students and had their heads shaved, to truly bloody acts such as when government officials were actually murdered or driven to commit suicide. As the frenzy built up in the summer of 1966, official party newspapers stoked the flames by calling on the masses to clear away the evil habits of the old society and attack the monsters and demons. By now, students in classrooms and on college campuses across China were organizing themselves into bands of so-called Red Guards, committed to preserving the Communist Revolution and rooting out what were termed the Four Olds: old ideas, old customs, old habits, and old culture. By the early autumn, gangs of teenagers wearing red armbands roamed the streets of cities such as Beijing and Shanghai, and the unrest was so visceral that August became known as Red August. Soon, the initial student-led violence spread to other groups, and factory workers and laborers on collectivized farms began joining what was termed the Red Terror. Meanwhile, Mao was directing these groups, as best they could be directed, against his enemies within the government and the wider party apparatus. But as a means of purging the party of his opponents, this was a very unstable method. By 1967, radical elements were threatening to move beyond Mao's ability to control them. But the Cultural Revolution nevertheless continued. In 1968, Mao initiated the Down to the Countryside, whereby the children of supposed middle-class bourgeois urban families were forced into what were effectively re-education camps in the countryside. Meanwhile, the chairman was building up an ever greater cult of personality around himself, in part led by the publication of his Little Red Book, a collection of his sayings and writings which became central to the concept of Maoism in China around this time. The violence continued unabated through the late 1960s, but by 1971, even Mao was aware of the need to scale things back, and though the Cultural Revolution is deemed by some to have only ended with Mao's death in 1976, the worst of the unrest subsided in the early 1970s. As with the enormous famine created by the Great Leap Forward 10 years earlier, historians have found it difficult to precisely identify how many people died as a result of the Cultural Revolution. Estimates tend to vary between 500,000 and 2 million people having lost their lives as a result of the violence which swept through China between 1966 and 1971. Many of these were killed by the Red Guards and other groups, triggered into fanaticism by Mao's injunctions. However, probably the greater proportion of these lost their lives in instances where the army was called in to quell the unrest, or by the army and the Communist Party being directed to purge certain groups by Mao himself. Just as damaging was the psychological pain inflicted on a society where people were effectively turned against each other by the state. Perhaps the most glaring example of this occurred in Guangxi province in the south of the country, where between 100,000 and 150,000 lives were lost during the Cultural Revolution. People here even resorted to burying the persecuted alive, or boiling or disemboweling them, and there was systematic cannibalism engaged in Guangxi, as the frenzied masses sought to literally devour their enemies in their fervor. Ultimately, the Cultural Revolution scarred Chinese society in ways which are hard to quantify. The early 1970s witnessed a major event in China's relations on the international stage, which has had important implications down to the present day. Chinese involvement in the Korean War had seen diplomatic ties between the People's Republic and the United States government effectively shut down, with trade sanctions imposed on China by Washington. However, with the passage of 20 years, both sides were cautiously investigating the possibility of re-establishing diplomatic ties. During the course of the 1968 US presidential election, the Republican candidate Richard Nixon had proposed making overtures to China to that effect, and after he entered office, negotiations commenced. In 1971, Nixon's national security advisor Henry Kissinger went on a secret diplomatic mission to Beijing, and this was followed in February 1972 by an official state visit in China by Nixon, during the course of which he met Mao, the first meeting between a Chinese and American head of state since the Second World War, which has grown ever greater in importance since. and which is now regarded by many as the most significant international relationship between two states in the world. Despite the veneer of normality which was lent to US-Chinese relations by the official state visit of Nixon in 1972, at home the Chinese government continued to operate in an extreme fashion. By the time Nixon visited, Mao was nearly 80 years of age, and owing to years of chain smoking, he was suffering from numerous physical ailments. It was due to this and the cult of personality which he had built up around himself that he allowed a number of senior Communist Party members to become immensely influential in China in his final years. These were known as the Gang of Four, which consisted of Mao's wife Jiang Qing, Jiang Zhongqiao, an ultra-Maoist writer who had come to prominence during the 1960s for his denunciation of bourgeois elements within Chinese society, a close ally of Chun Qiao's, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen, a younger political figure who had risen from within the Shanghai branch of the Chinese Communist Party to become one of its highest-ranking figures during the Cultural Revolution. The Gang of Four had done much to promote the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1971. But even after the most extreme period of the purges ended in the late 1960s, their influence over Mao's government continued. The last years of Mao's life and his primacy in the politics of China are hard to characterize, as competing forces were at work in the halls of power in Beijing. Certainly, Mao remained wedded to the idea of clinging to power until the very end. As a result, he continued to allow the Gang of Four and their supporters to hold considerable influence in the country. However, separately, there was a growing clique of individuals who coalesced around other older stalwarts of the party, such as the former head of the Red Army and Premier Zhou Enlai, and the former General Secretary of the party Deng Xiaoping, who wished to break from some of the more traditional ideological values of the party espoused by Mao and introduce a greater degree of professionalism into the running of the government and the economy. There was also much bitterness within the party establishment at the damage wrought by the Cultural Revolution, as individuals who had fought the Japanese and the nationalists in the 1930s and 1940s had often been purged from the party in the late 1960s, only to be gradually rehabilitated in the 1970s. Acrimony between all these groups characterized the politics of China in the final years of Mao's life, and it was he himself who was largely responsible for creating this situation. The political uncertainty of the post-Cultural Revolution period was still unresolved as Mao entered the final stages of his life. His health had further deteriorated in the mid-1970s, and he was suffering from several heart and lung ailments, the latter aggravated considerably by his chain smoking, while there were unconfirmed rumors of a considerable reliance on sleeping pills which had developed over the years. On the 27th of May 1976, he met the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, on a state visit at which the last known photo of Mao was taken. But by then, he had already suffered the first of several heart attacks that occurred between the spring and autumn of 1976, and which left him increasingly incapacitated. The final one on the 5th of September left him largely unable to move, and he died 4 days later. A state funeral lasting a week followed between the 11th and the 18th of September 1976, during which 1 million Chinese people filed past his body. Today, the enormous mausoleum of Mao Zedong housing his embalmed body stands in the middle of Tiananmen Square in central Beijing, on the site where the Gate of China, the southern gate of the old imperial city between the 14th and the 20th centuries, used to stand, before its destruction in 1954. It is perhaps fitting as a statement of where ancient China ended and modern China began. Mao's death occurred at a time when the older leadership of the entire Chinese Communist Party, the generation who had come to political consciousness during the May 4th movement all the way back in 1919, was fading from Chinese life. The old leader of the Red Army, and a possible successor to Mao, Zhou Enlai, had predeceased Mao by just a few months. Consequently, Mao had appointed the Minister for Public Security, Hua Guofeng, as his successor shortly before his death. He succeeded as chairman of the Chinese Communist Party in 1976. But he would not last long. Guofeng was outmaneuvered in the years that followed by Deng Xiaoping, who became the de facto leader of China in 1978, though Guofeng's brief period as leader was significant in arresting and charging the Gang of Four as being responsible for the excesses of the Cultural Revolution. In all but one instance, they subsequently were sentenced to life in prison under Deng Xiaoping's leadership. Elsewhere, despite his impeccable communist credentials, Deng Xiaoping quickly moved China away from its planned economy and the more authoritarian aspects of Mao's reign, setting term limits on the holding of office. It was during Deng's tenure as Mao's successor that the roots of China's economic miracle can really be found, as he opened the country up to foreign investment and expertise. Thus, in the end, Mao proved to be the impediment to China's growth, rather than the deliverer of it. Mao Zedong is one of the most contentious individuals in Chinese history, and indeed the history of the modern world. To some, he was a brutal tyrant and a mass murderer, under whose rule between 1949 and 1946, over 50 million people and perhaps as many as 80 million died prematurely, whether as a result of the catastrophic failures of the Great Leap Forward, the waves of violence unleashed during the Cultural Revolution, or government-orchestrated disasters such as the Banqiao Dam failure of 1975, which by some estimates resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 people. However, to many others, he is one of the great heroes of modern-day China, the man who ensured that the cause of Chinese communism survived during the Long March of the 1930s, the commander who led Chinese resistance to the Japanese occupation during the Second World War, and the individual who thereafter led the Red Army to victory over the nationalists. Many who focus on his achievements will also point towards the fact that life expectancy rates and living standards in China increased dramatically between the 1940s and the 1970s, and argue that Mao laid the basis for China's economic miracle, which began in the late 20th century. It is indeed striking that one individual can provoke such widely diverging opinions. There is no doubting Mao's critical role in ensuring the ascent to power of the Communist Party in China. Without Mao, the movement might not have survived the 1930s, and his leadership was also critical in the post-war period. But once he secured power, this individual, who was clearly possessed of a considerable intellect and ability, became obsessed with retaining and expanding his control of China at the expense of lives and social stability. It was his desire to not play second fiddle to Khrushchev and the Russians which drove China into the disastrous Great Leap Forward, and his unwillingness to accept how badly things had gone wrong, which saw the famine which the second five-year plan created drag on for years and kill somewhere between 30 and 50 million Chinese people. It was Mao's pathological desire to reinforce his position as head of the Chinese state in the mid-1960s which led to the violence and instability of the Cultural Revolution. The Mao of the 1950s and 1960s was a different one to the individual who first joined the party in 1921 and initiated the Long March in 1934. Those who knew him over the course of his life often confirmed that he changed considerably over the years. What do you think of Mao Zedong? Do you think he was actually committed to the idea of communism? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.